Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into the explosive claims from Charlotte Iserbyt's book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. Now, this book puts forward a pretty radical theory that the problems we see in our schools, they aren't an accident. It argues they're actually the result of a long-term intentional plan. So let's explore the arguments.
So the whole book really revolves around this one huge question. Is the crisis in our schools today just an accident? The author's answer is a resounding no. She frames things like falling test scores and moral confusion not as system failures, but as the successful outcome of an intentional, decades-long agenda. And this quote right here, it really gets to the heart of the whole thing. The core idea isn't that the American education system failed. No, the author argues it actually succeeded at implementing a plan to completely reshape society by, well, reshaping its children first. Okay, so if we're going with the idea that this decline wasn't an accident, then how on earth did it happen? Well, the book flat out rejects the idea that schools just kind of lost their way. Instead, it argues for a very deliberate, multi-generational strategy. The author calls this strategy gradualism. You know, like the old story of the frog and slowly boiling water. The changes were so slow, they went almost unnoticed. And the key tool, she claims, is something called the Hegelian dialectic. To put it simply, you create a problem, say a literacy crisis, which gets the public into a panic. Then you swoop in and offer your pre-planned solution, a solution that pushes your agenda forward, and one the public never would have accepted otherwise. So who does the book point the finger at? Who are the supposed architects of this new order? Well, it lays out a century's worth of influential figures and philosophies that it claims were responsible for shifting education away from academics and turning it towards social engineering. This timeline here really lays out the alleged pattern. The author is basically connecting the dots, from John Dewey's focus on social education to UNESCO's push for world citizenship, all the way to B.F. Skinner's behavioral psychology. The argument is that these weren't just isolated events, but calculated steps that laid the groundwork for turning schools into laboratories for social change. And to back this up, the book pulls out some pretty shocking quotes from influential people, like this one from the philosopher Bertrand Russell. This is presented as stark, undeniable evidence of an agenda to create a population that's been conditioned by the education system itself to be completely incapable of dissent. All right, so if those were the architects, what were their tools? What was in their toolkit? The book dives into some very specific classroom techniques, but it reframes them, not as innovative teaching methods, but as psychological tools designed for behavioral change. One of the big ones the book really goes after is operant conditioning. It argues that programs that use this, like something called direct instruction, they don't teach students how to think. Instead, students are just trained, through stimulus and response, to give the correct answer. The author's view is that it treats them more like lab animals than as independent human thinkers. And then there's this thing called values clarification. The book claims its whole purpose was to deliberately drive a wedge between children and the values their parents taught them, through exercises like role-playing tough moral dilemmas or having kids keep personal diaries. The alleged goal was to replace traditional morals with situational ethics, which she says creates a kind of moral chaos. This table just lays it all out, side by side. It really sums up the book's central conflict. On one side, you have traditional education, focused on knowledge, logic, facts, and creating independent thinkers. And on the other, what the author calls the new education. This new system, she argues, prioritizes feelings, group consensus, and producing socialized group members, and get this, all at a massively higher cost. So what's the endgame here? If the goal was to completely change the system, what was the ultimate point of it all? Well, the book argues the endgame wasn't just about creating compliant citizens. It was about creating a very specific kind of global workforce. The author lays out what she sees as a four-step path to get there. First, you bring in school-to-work programs that make career prep the main focus. Second, you get rid of academic grades and replace them with workplace competencies. Then that morphs into a system of lifelong learning managed by the state. The final step? To create workers who are trained for very specific jobs in a planned global economy. And here's where the book presents what it sees as some pretty damning evidence. It points to educators like Harold Shane, who, way back in 1976, was calling for educating young people for planetary service and world citizenship. The book presents this as a smoking gun, direct evidence of an agenda to train global servants instead of educating citizens for a republic. Okay, so after laying out this really incredible, controversial thesis that spans decades, the book doesn't just leave you in despair. It actually wraps up with a very specific and pretty radical call to action for parents and local communities.
The author's solution is basically to hit the undo button on the whole thing. It's all based on one simple idea. Whoever holds the purse strings calls the shots. So she advocates for total decentralization. We're talking 100% local funding, getting rid of federal and state money entirely, and hiring teachers based on what they know about a subject, not on education theory. It's all about bringing the focus back to the absolute basics.
And it all boils down to this one fundamental argument she makes. Providing a classic academic education is actually pretty cheap. What has bankrupted the system, in her view, isn't the cost of teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's the massive expense of schools taking on all these other roles: social worker, psychologist, and workforce trainer.
So, there you have it. We've just walked through the core arguments of a deeply controversial book, a theory of a century-long deliberate plan. Now, whether you see this as a conspiracy theory or a chilling expose, it definitely forces us all to confront a really fundamental question. After hearing all this, what does the purpose of school really mean to you today?